On November 12, 2026, the Coca-Cola company filed paperwork in Sacramento confirming the permanent closure of its Downey bottling facility, the last full-scale Coca-Cola production plant operating inside the state of California. 47 years of continuous operation in that one building gone, 880 unionized jobs eliminated, and the state of California just lost an estimated $312 million in annual economic activity that will never be recovered. Now, I have watched a lot of companies move in my 95 years on this earth. I have watched factories open in places nobody believed could support them and close in places everyone assumed were permanent. I have watched the most stable businesses on the continent quietly reassess where they wanted to be 10 years from now and act on the answer. But what just happened between Coca-Cola and the state of California is something I want to walk you through carefully. Because this is not a story about a soda company moving its bottling lines to Arizona and Nevada. This is a story about a state that watched its own competitive position erode for a decade, listened to its own governor describe the mechanism of that erosion on a public stage, and is now staring at an empty 600,000 square foot facility in Downey, wondering what comes next. And the people paying for that empty building are not executives in Atlanta. They are the 880 workers who showed up to that plant every morning, and the working families across Southern California who never had the option to leave. I have been sitting in the same office in Omaha, Nebraska for over 50 years. Same desk, same chair, same view of a parking lot that has not changed in any meaningful way since the Carter administration. I drink about 5 cherry Cokes a day, and I have been doing that long enough that the people at the bottling plant in Omaha used to know my standing order by heart. I still live in the house I bought in 1958 for $31,500. And every single morning I show up to that office because there is nothing on this earth I would rather be doing. People ask me all the time why I never moved Berkshire Hathaway to a coast, why I never chased California sunshine or New York prestige, and I always give them the same answer. Because the business I was building did not care what zip code I was sitting in. The numbers worked in Omaha, so I stayed in Omaha. Coca-Cola operated bottling facilities in California for 47 years for exactly the same reason. The numbers worked, and then they stopped working. And the moment they stopped, the company did what any rational corporation does when the arithmetic changes. It followed the math. Now, let me tell you how a syrup recipe from the Atlanta pharmacy in 1886 became one of the most recognizable commercial brands in the history of human civilization. Coca-Cola did not become Coca-Cola by selling syrup. It became Coca-Cola by building the most disciplined bottling and distribution network the world had ever seen. The Downey plant was not a side operation. When it opened in 1979, it was one of the crown jewels of the company's Western distribution system, sitting on 24 acres, producing roughly 40 million cases of beverage a year at its peak, serving the entire Los Angeles metropolitan basin and a substantial portion of the Pacific Southwest. The facility supported 880 unionized jobs directly and, by the company's own estimates filed with the state in 2024, somewhere between 2,400 and 2,800 additional jobs indirectly through trucking, suppliers, maintenance contractors, and local retail. Coca-Cola was not just a tenant in California. It was a load-bearing pillar of the state's manufacturing and distribution economy in the southern counties. The Downey facility alone generated, by the company's regulatory filings, approximately $312 million in annual economic activity inside California's borders. And California had 47 years to understand exactly what that facility represented. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what happened next, because this is where my partner Charlie Munger's most important lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Charlie used to say, "Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome." Always the incentives, not the intentions, not the press releases, not the speeches at industry dinners, the incentives. So let us look honestly at the incentive that California built for a beverage manufacturer operating inside its borders over the last decade. And let me be clear at the start. The people who built this incentive structure were not bad people. They were responding to genuine public health concerns about sugar consumption, genuine environmental concerns about plastic waste, genuine labor concerns about wages in industrial facilities. I understand every one of those impulses. I have watched diabetes rates rise in this country for 60 years. The concerns were real, but over a period stretching from roughly 2016 through 2026, California assembled a stack of policies that, taken individually, each seemed reasonable, and taken together produced a mathematical conclusion the legislature never quite stopped to calculate. There was the expansion of the state's bottle redemption program, raising California redemption value fees on beverage containers. There was Senate Bill 54, the producer responsibility law for plastic packaging, signed in 2022, with compliance costs phasing in through 2026. There was the steady rise in industrial electricity rates, which by the second quarter of 2026 were running approximately 87% higher than the rates in Arizona and 94% higher than the rates in Nevada for comparable industrial consumption. There was the state's water usage reporting requirement for high-volume manufacturers, layered on top of drought surcharges in Los Angeles County. And then in March of 2026 came the fatal detail. The California Air Resources Board issued a new compliance schedule for industrial refrigerant emissions that required full retrofit of every commercial bottling line in the state by January 1st, 2028, at an estimated capital cost per facility of between $34 million and $41 million. For the Downey plant specifically, the company's internal estimate, later disclosed in shareholder filings, was $38.7 million. Now, I want you to read that number the way the board of directors of the Coca-Cola company read it in the spring of 2026. If you are sitting in Atlanta with a team of advisors, and every major corporation has a team of advisors, that is one of the things major corporations reliably spend money on, you are looking at $38.7 million in capital expenditure required at a single facility on a compliance deadline you do not control, in a state where your operating costs are already running materially higher than your costs in 3 neighboring states. You compare that figure to the cost of expanding existing facilities in Phoenix and in Las Vegas, both of which have lower energy costs, lower water costs, lower regulatory overhead, and no comparable refrigerant retrofit mandate on the books. The math is not close. It is not even an interesting question. The window to act is not after the deadline. The window is now, while the capital is liquid and the alternatives are still cheaper than the retrofit. Clear incentives produce predictable behavior every single time. What followed was not a single corporate decision made in isolation. It was a bank run. I want you to hold that image because it is exactly right. When depositors believe a bank is about to fail, they do not wait politely for official confirmation. The ones who move first lose nothing. The ones who wait lose everything. So everyone moves first. That is the structure of what has been happening to California manufacturing for the better part of a decade. The largest industrial employers in the state have been making the same simultaneous rational calculation Coca-Cola just finalized, and they have been quietly withdrawing capital, withdrawing production lines, withdrawing forward commitments before the next compliance window closes. And the Downey announcement, when it came on November 12th, did not arrive alone. Chevron had already relocated its corporate headquarters from San Ramon to Houston, Texas in 2024, after a century in California. Tesla had moved its headquarters from Palo Alto to Austin, Texas in 2021. Charles Schwab, founded in San Francisco, moved its headquarters to Westlake, Texas. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, the direct corporate descendant of the company that arguably founded Silicon Valley itself, relocated to Spring, Texas. Oracle, founded by Larry Ellison, moved to Austin. McKesson, the largest healthcare company in California by revenue, moved to Irving, Texas. Jacobs Engineering, headquartered in Pasadena for decades, moved to Dallas. Stone Brewing closed its main California production. And now, the largest bottler of the most recognizable beverage on the planet, after 47 years in Downey, has filed its closure paperwork in Sacramento. And in my experience, the names you can confirm publicly in any corporate migration are rarely the complete list. The estimated aggregate loss to California's industrial tax base from confirmed headquarters relocations alone since 2020 exceeds $4.2 billion in annual state revenue. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $4.2 billion, that single figure, the annual loss from confirmed departures, exceeds the entire annual budget of the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, in a state where wildfire response is one of the defining public obligations of the government. Now, I am going to tell you about the moment in this story that I find the most extraordinary. The moment that, to my mind, defines this entire situation better than any spreadsheet or closure announcement possibly could. October 8th, 2026, the Milken Institute is hosting its California Summit in Beverly Hills. Governor Gavin Newsom takes the stage for a fireside conversation with a moderator from Bloomberg. It is 35 days before Coca-Cola's Downey closure paperwork is officially filed in Sacramento. 35 days. And standing in front of an audience of business leaders, fund managers, and journalists in a venue specifically designed to attract industrial investment to the state, the governor of California says, in his own words, that California's regulatory environment has, and I am quoting from the published transcript, made it harder for manufacturers to justify expansion here, and that the state must, again quoting directly, be honest about the fact that compliance stacking has become a real competitive disadvantage. The sitting governor of California, on a public stage in Beverly Hills, 35 days before the largest single beverage manufacturing closure in the state's recent history was officially filed, describing with complete accuracy the precise mechanism of deterioration that was already executing while he stood there and spoke. I have been in business a long time. I have sat across the table from a lot of extraordinarily capable people, and I will tell you honestly, I cannot think of a parallel. A chief executive publicly and accurately describing the failure conditions of his own administration's regulatory framework while the failure was already in motion, while he was simultaneously continuing to sign the legislation that made it inevitable. That is not contradiction. That is a governing failure so thoroughly documented in real time that it almost defies analysis. Now, step away from the executives in Atlanta entirely for a moment. My father, Howard Buffett, was a congressman from Nebraska and a deeply principled man who taught me that the measure of any economic policy is never what it promises on the day it is announced. It is what it delivers to ordinary people living inside it 10 years later. So let me tell you about Reynaldo Ortiz. Reynaldo worked the second shift on bottling line 3 at the Downey facility for 22 years. He is 54 years old. He is the president of his Teamsters local. His daughter is a sophomore at Cal State Long Beach studying nursing, paid for partly out of his union wages and partly out of a tuition assistance benefit negotiated into his contract. His wife works part-time at a dental office in Bellflower. They bought their house in Norwalk in 2009, refinanced it twice as rates allowed, and were on a schedule to have it paid off in 2031. The closure announcement gives Reynaldo and his co-workers 90 days of notice and a severance package that the local estimates will cover, on average, between 4 and 7 months of household expenses for the affected workers. The $312 million in annual economic activity the Downey plant generated was not an abstraction to Reynaldo. It was the difference between a daughter who finishes her nursing degree on schedule and one who has to take a year off to work. It was the difference between a mortgage paid on time and one that quietly slips into hardship. He did nothing to cause this. He had no seat at the table when the refrigerant rule was written, and the gap that the Downey plant's departure leaves does not quietly disappear when the trucks roll out of the parking lot. It falls straight down onto the people who stayed. In my experience, damage of this kind moves in distinct layers. One facility closes. The corporate parent writes down its California physical footprint and reallocates the capital to facilities in other states. The city of Downey, which had built portions of its long-range general plan around the continued operation of that 24-acre industrial site, loses approximately $4.8 million in annual property and utility tax revenue, plus an estimated additional $2.1 million in indirect business tax receipts from the trucking and supplier ecosystem that orbited the plant. The local school district, which is funded in part through those property tax flows, begins quietly modeling reductions in its facilities maintenance budget for the 2027-2028 academic year. The two diners across the street from the plant, which together employed 31 people and built their business models around 3 shifts of bottling workers, are now looking at a customer base that no longer exists. The local Teamsters Hall, which used to host the Friday afternoon dues meetings for the Downey membership, is now trying to figure out how to support 880 displaced families during a job search in a regional industrial economy that is contracting on a 10-year trend line. That is 3 full levels of damage from a single facility closure. Multiply that structure across the 8 confirmed major headquarters relocations and the unknown number of unconfirmed production line closures, and you begin to understand the actual magnitude of what has happened to California's industrial base. And California is not running this experiment alone. That is the part I need you to hear clearly. New Jersey is currently in the 3rd year of debating its own version of the producer responsibility law, with a compliance deadline pending for 2028. Oregon enacted a similar framework in 2023, and by the 3rd quarter of 2026, the Oregon Business and Industry Association was reporting that 14% of its manufacturing membership had relocated production capacity to Idaho or Washington. Massachusetts has been steadily raising the compliance burden on industrial refrigerant users since 2024, and General Electric closed its Lynn Aviation facility partly in response. Illinois has been losing corporate headquarters to Indiana and Tennessee at a pace that, by the Illinois Policy Institute's reporting, has cost the state approximately $1.8 billion in annual revenue since 2020. The same template, the same incentive structure, the same mathematically predictable outcome, running on a slightly delayed timeline in each state. This is not 5 separate state-level stories. This is one national story about what happens when the incentive to leave becomes structurally more powerful than the incentive to stay. And right now, that story is accelerating in ways the daily news cycle is not fully tracking. I have made a lot of investments over the course of 70 years of reading financial statements, and the single most important lesson I have learned across all of it is this: you cannot earn your way out of a structural mistake by hoping that the people most affected by it will not notice what you have done. They notice, they always notice, and when they have the means and the mobility to act on what they notice, they act, without exception, without sentiment, without waiting for permission. California is now attempting to figure out how to replace a manufacturing base that has been quietly walking out the back door for the better part of a decade. The company that opened the Downey plant in 1979 is reallocating its capital to Phoenix and Las Vegas. Ronaldo Ortiz is updating his resume for the first time in 22 years. The school district in Downey is modeling its 2028 budget around a property tax base that just shrank. And the governor who described the precise mechanism of this departure on a stage in Beverly Hills 35 days before the paperwork was filed is preparing to deliver his next State of the State address. I stayed in Omaha my entire life because Omaha never gave me a reason to leave. That is the only reason any person or any business stays anywhere. Not loyalty, not habit, not sentiment. The math. Change the math and you change the behavior every single time, without a single exception in the history of commerce. The money never sits still when you announce publicly where you intend to send it, and capital never stays in a place that has stopped making the arithmetic work. If you are watching this from a state where these conversations are just beginning, where the legislature is debating its own producer responsibility framework or its own refrigerant compliance schedule or its own industrial electricity rate adjustments, you are not watching California's problem from a safe distance. You're watching your own situation playing out one election cycle ahead of you. If you have seen factories close quietly in your county, neighbors stop talking about plans they used to mention, or job postings simply stop appearing the way they once did, leave a comment below, tell us what state you are in, what industry you work in, what you are actually seeing on the ground. Subscribe to this channel, because this story is nowhere near finished. The numbers are still moving, and wherever the numbers go, the story follows. They always do.